Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a drama, horror, and sci-fi film called Here Alone. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Alone in the wilderness, Anne tries to catch her breath. She carries a rifle and is completely covered in dirt. She's looking at her car trunk, which contains several cans of food among other objects. Noticing her dwindling food supply, she sighs and slams the trunk shut, leaving her car camp. Afterward, Anne heads to a lake and removes all her clothes to wash off all the dirt from her face and body. Now freshened up, Anne walks into an empty field carrying a crank radio. She sits on a tree trunk and cranks the radio, waiting for a signal. A broadcast comes through, but it's in French, which Anne cannot understand. Anne thinks back to when she was still with her husband Jason and their baby girl Haley. Anne carried Haley in her arms while they were frantically emptying their closets to pack up and leave. Suddenly, the power went out. Jason tried to remain calm and instructed Anne to continue packing. Back in the present, Anne miserably clutches a piece of Haley's clothing and smells it, sighing in sorrow as she remembers her daughter. Anne has set up her own little camp by the lake, where she has hung her wet clothes to dry and started a fire. She grudgingly collects the heap of animal droppings she found nearby and places them in a bag. After this, Anne uses a knife to carve out some worms from a tree trunk and gather them in a cut-up plastic bottle. Then, she looks for shrubs and flips through a guidebook to help her identify various wild berries. When she's done, she sets up an animal trap for later. Anne returns to her lake camp and snacks on some biscuits as well as the worms and berries she had collected earlier. However, she later throws up after eating the worms, then lies on her back while gazing at the sky. Anne lets a tear fall for what her life has become, then closes her eyes and reminisces about what happened after she and Jason had packed their bags. In a flashback, she was in the car with Jason and Haley. As Jason was driving, a radio broadcast informed them of the viral infection that had severely infected the population. The broadcaster stated that symptoms of the infection included a red rash of the abdomen or chest, which would be followed by nausea and violent behavior. Suddenly, Anne spotted a family of 3 on the road in front of them and begged Jason to stop the car, expressing her concern for the child. However, Jason simply ignored her pleas and drove past the family, rebuking that they have their own child to care for. In the present time, Anne has woken up and is walking through the forest with her backpack, bucket, and rifle. When she arrives at her car camp, she approaches a tree trunk and combs through the leaves on the floor to get the car keys she had hidden there. She unlocks the car trunk and places her backpack inside before closing it. She uses her hands to cover the car windows with dirt and conceal the inside, empties her bladder into a bucket, and enters her car as night falls. Safely inside the car where Anne sleeps at night, she mournfully plays with Haley's toy in remembrance of her. In the morning, Anne counts the number of biscuits she has. When Anne realizes she only has 11 pieces left, she begins worrying. So she immediately checks her animal trap to see if it got anything. Anne finds the box closed, readies her knife for the animal, and then carefully lifts it. Seeing nothing underneath, she hurls the box away furiously and stabs the ground in frustration, knowing that she will starve if she doesn't find any food soon. Later in her car, Anne ponders once more about the past, and it turns out that Jason was the one who brought her and Haley to those woods. Jason also taught her everything she knows now, such as identifying berries, setting up an animal trap, and using a rifle. Night soon came, and Anne and Jason sat by the fire, saying they couldn't survive on a handful of berries. With the same problem in mind, Anne is once again inside her car in the present time, and she plays with Haley's toy. When she returns to her lake camp with her urine bucket, she heats a knife by the fire and cuts her arm. Then, she grimaces in pain and uses a jar to collect her blood. Later, she mushes up the droppings in her bag and then goes to the lake and lathers them all over her face and bare body. Soon afterward, Anne is completely covered in animal droppings and fully clothed, ready to head out. Anne takes her firearm, hangs a mask around her neck, then loads a few bullets into the rifle, and cautiously creeps through the wilderness with her rifle at the ready. When she reaches the familiar place, she puts her mask on and checks her surroundings before approaching the chain link fence. Anne immediately takes Haley's toy out of her backpack and ties it to the fence, lodging a stick in it so it would repeatedly make noise and attract the infected. She rushes to take the jar of her blood out of her bag and pour it on the toy. When she's done setting up the bait for the infected, she hears a wild shriek, prompting her to run away quickly. Anne runs through the forest to get to the other side of the chain link fence, which is guarding a large home. She throws her bag over and slides her rifle into a hole at the bottom. Once over the fence, she warily crosses the field, holding her rifle, before reaching the house. When she gets there, she unloads a trash can, turns it over to use as a stool, and sneaks inside the home. Anne gets inside and walks through a hallway to reach the living room. where a dead couple is sitting on the sofa. Suddenly, Anne hears the infected shrieking from outside, causing her to hurry into the kitchen and begin her raid for food. She packs as much as she can into her bag, panicking as the shrieks get louder. On her way out, she accidentally knocks the trash can over, causing it to make a loud bang. Hearing this, Anne stays alert for any sign of danger, then sighs as she hears the shrieks approaching. Anne races to the fence to the group of the infected on her trail. With not enough time to climb over, Anne resorts to sliding her way through the small hole in the fence, but her abdomen gets injured in the process. Luckily, she still makes it through and escapes. Anne collapses while running away, unknowingly dropping several cans of food from her backpack. She takes her cardigan and presses it on her wound. But because she's in a hurry to get away, she doesn't realize that she has left her food supplies behind. Anne has now safely returned to the lake, where she gingerly cleans herself and her wound. After this, she uses a needle and thread to stitch up her wound, struggling to endure the pain. Sometime later in the field, Anne remembers when Jason returned from a food raid with an injury of his own. Jason ordered her to pack up their things and get in the car. On the road, he explained to her that he had cut himself sneaking into the house and bled, causing the infected to swarm the place. The next day in the present, Anne empties her backpack into the car trunk when she realizes she had dropped the food on her way back yesterday. Anne returns to her route to retrieve the food. On her way back, she hears a girl's voice and finds a teenage girl dragging a man across the road, who then falls unconscious. She points her rifle at them and asks the girl, Olivia, if the man is infected. Olivia lifts the shirt of the guy, Chris, to show Anne that he has no rash on his abdomen. After seeing this, Anne finally approaches and helps Olivia tend to Chris's head wound. Then, they both carry Chris to Anne's car camp. When they get there, Anne pitches her tent for Chris, whose head wound has been patched up. They haul him inside the tent before settling down by the fire, where Anne makes small talk. Olivia reveals that Chris is her stepdad and refuses when Anne tells her she can sleep in her car, saying she wants to sleep next to Chris in the tent. In the morning, Olivia helps Anne with her daily chores but shows reluctance to collect the animal droppings. So Anne explains that the droppings help to cover their scent from the infected. After hearing this, Olivia begrudgingly picks up the pile of dung. When Anne and Olivia return to the car camp that night, they find that Chris is finally awake. Later, Olivia is asleep when Chris tells Anne that he and Olivia are headed north. He adds that many people would kill for all her gear and supplies. Hearing this makes Anne wary of him, especially when he asks if her car has a filled tank, to which she quickly replies no. Anne thinks they might steal her car if they are desperate enough to get to the north. Seeing Anne's apprehension, Chris drops the subject, thanks her for her kindness to him and Olivia, and assures her they'll be gone by morning. Olivia and Chris are still there the day after that, and they help Anne fish in the river. That night by the fire, Anne thinks back to when she and Jason had been together in front of one. Anne urged Jason to find something for Haley's fever and more food for them. She helped Jason lather mud on himself to mask his scent, then said goodbye and watched him go. She then sat by the fire and anxiously waited for his return. But suddenly, she heard shrieks and gunshots from afar. The following day in the present, Olivia and Chris are still at the camp, but the more time Anne spends with them, the more she seems to enjoy their company. When the three of them go swimming in the lake, Olivia soon grows uneasy when she realizes that Chris and Anne are too engrossed in each other to notice her. Olivia sulks later that night as she watches Chris and Anne flirting. The next morning, Chris tells Olivia that he wants Anne to go with them to the north because she took them in and cared for them. Olivia, however, doesn't seem to agree with her stepdad. Later that day, when Olivia asks Anne how Jason had proposed to her, Anne is again taken back to the past, to when she found Jason all bloodied up in the field after he had gone on a raid. She kneeled beside him and looked at him in disbelief before checking his supplies. Anne was speechless when she found a medicine bottle in Jason's hand, knowing he did everything he could for her and Haley before he died. That was when Anne parked their car in the middle of the woods and covered it with branches and leaves, before placing Haley inside. With her face covered with mud, she said goodbye to Haley before heading out for a raid. Moments later, Anne approached a mansion and quietly entered the front door. She tiptoed upstairs, where she found an infected woman feasting on raw meat in front of a refrigerator. After shooting the infected woman, blood got on her mask and jacket, which she quickly tried to wipe off with a rag before getting some medicine. Anne then ran back to her car and immediately took Haley in her arms to soothe her cries. But when she looked at Haley, she noticed blood around Haley's mouth and realized with horror that it had come from the infected woman's blood on her jacket. In the present, Anne and Chris are bantering while walking back to their camp in the evening. Meanwhile, Olivia lathers lotion on herself inside the tent, removes her underwear, and then fixes her hair as she waits for Chris. Anne and Chris say goodnight to each other before parting ways. However, Chris stops for a moment and then decides to get in the car instead of the tent. Suddenly, he kisses Anne and closes the door behind him as they make out. Olivia hears what's happening in the car and can only look pathetically at herself and her pile of undergarments. She had hoped something would happen between her and Chris instead. Later that evening, Olivia exits her tent and takes the car keys from Anne's secret pile. Anne gets out of the car the next morning only to find the trunk open and most of her food supply gone. She angrily slams it shut, realizing that Olivia had taken her stuff. Concurrently, Olivia is out in the field with the radio and snacking on Anne's food out of spite. When she decides to return to the camp, she comes across an infected woman. At the camp, Chris apologizes to Anne about her food when they suddenly hear Olivia scream. Chris immediately races to find her while Anne quickly gets her rifle before following him. What she doesn't realize is she left the bullets in her car. Olivia frantically runs away from the infected woman, but she's soon trapped underneath her. Luckily, Chris arrives just in time to save her and fight the woman, who quickly gains the upper hand. When Anne uses her rifle, she realizes there are no bullets, so she rushes over and instead uses it to whack the woman over the head. Chris takes the rifle from her to smash the woman's head repeatedly, then breaks down in tears while Olivia and Anne watch him. In another flashback, Anne was playing with Haley when she noticed the rash on the baby's abdomen, signifying that Haley had been infected. She rushed outside to put a damp cloth on Haley's abdomen, then broke down in tears as she realized she had infected her daughter. Later, Chris implores Anne to go north with them and stop punishing herself for what happened to Haley. After that, Anne tells Chris and Olivia that they need to raid the house one last time, signifying that she has finally agreed to go with them. Despite Chris's initial hesitation, Olivia manages to convince him to let her help them. Then, Anne goes over the plan with Olivia as she lathers animal droppings on her. Anne explains that Chris will distract the infected while she and Olivia will fill their bags with food. Olivia is still in a sour mood about Chris and Anne. Olivia and Anne take their positions on the fence near the house, while Chris goes to another side. Chris cuts his arm with a knife and slathers his blood on his body to attract the infected. The shrieks signal Olivia and Anne to enter the house, so they hurry inside. Meanwhile, Chris sees the first wave of the infected running toward him, so he immediately runs in another direction. Inside the house, Anne collects food as quickly as she can while Olivia walks to the living room and sees her rifle. The dead couple from earlier has already been eaten by the infected. On Anne's way out, she's suddenly hit in the head by the butt of a rifle, and she looks up to see that Olivia has done it. Olivia drags a dazed Anne to the kitchen and ties her to the kitchen cabinet. Despite Anne's pleas, Olivia removes Anne's mask and screams as loud as she can to attract the infected, then quickly grabs the supplies and leaves. Anne manages to untie herself and soak her body in bleach to cover her scent as the infected approach the house. She hides in the freezer just before one of them enters the house, and when she hears no more noise, she runs outside and sprints back to the camp. Olivia gets there before her, and Chris demands to know where Anne is. Suddenly, a group of the infected attacks them. Anne arrives to see Chris struggle to fight them off and tries to shoot them from afar. While doing so, Anne remembers deciding to feed Haley a bottled mixture of aspirin, baby formula, and her own blood, then cried as she gave her daughter a peaceful death. Unfortunately, Chris is ultimately bitten by one of the infected, so Anne and Olivia take the car and leave him behind. Inside the car, Olivia rests her head on Anne's lap. Anne, overwhelmed by everything that happened, lets out a deafening scream.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.